Injuries come with the territory when you're an athlete. Everything from broken bones to concussions to internal bleeding. Pain is sometimes the price paid for sport, but in the ancient days, sometimes the price paid was death. Starting sometime between the 10th and 15th century, buzkashi is one of the most ancient sports in Central Asia and is built around the idea that leaders are men who can seize control by means foul and fair, and then fight off their rivals. The objective of the game involves moving a headless, limbless, disemboweled goat carcass to the other side of the field and into your team's goal, usually marked by a circle. Prior to the game, the carcass was often soaked in water and packed with sand, weighing up to 160 pounds. When the 10 riders on each team mounted their horses, the game began and could last up to 24 hours, with thousands of spectators watching. Riders carried whips to use on other players' horses and weren't technically allowed to be used on other riders, though they usually disregarded this rule. From the long hours spent on a horse to the many piercing wounds from whips to the fatigue from carrying a heavy, decaying, beheaded goat up and down a field, it wasn't uncommon to see players fall from their horses. Whether with a goat, sheep, or a calf, this sport is still practiced today and is the national sport of Afghanistan, though they tend to follow the rules a little more closely than their ancestors. The Vikings are portrayed as fearless and strong, so it comes as no surprise to learn that they spent their free time competing with one another. Competitions ranged from holding opponents underwater the longest to throwing boulders the furthest, but the most common sport was Glima, a form of wrestling. But make no mistake, this truly was the wrestling of Vikings. It was a sport that mixed wrestling, Scandinavian martial arts, and tactics of war. Combat Glima followed an anything-goes mentality. Men were encouraged to use any technique necessary to win, including using weapons like axes and swords. In these cases, the loser usually ended up dead. A large stone in the middle of the field was used in morbidly creative ways, depending on the player. One record tells of a man forced against the stone by his opponent. He climbed up over the stone, dragging his adversary with him. He then pushed off, bringing his foe down upon it, and jumped on the man's back, breaking his ribs and killing him. Another tale illustrates how one man won a match by dragging his rival over the stone and splitting him in half. Vikings frequently stared death in the face, both in battle and at leisure. Glima served as a tool for weeding out the weak and finding those with the backbone to take down their enemies by any means necessary. The battles of the gladiators in the Colosseum are infamous for ending in death, but true gladiator battles were not as gruesome as the movies portray, and were nothing in comparison to a game called Vinash EO. Vinash EO often involved a bestiary, a hunter of wild beasts, who was armed and pitted against exotic animals. Usually, a bestiary was victorious and slaughtered over 1,000 animals in one day. The game eventually became compulsory for prisoners to play, and prisoners didn't get the luxury of weapons and armor. Instead, they were thrown into the arena with several starved and ravenous wild animals and forced to defend themselves with very little success. Prisoners often attempted suicide to get out of Vinash EO. One prisoner shoved a toilet brush into his throat while he was left alone to relieve himself, while another group of prisoners took turns strangling each other. Another man pretended to fall asleep and let his head dangle between the spokes of the wheel while being carted to the arena. If there weren't enough convicts to take part in the Vinash EO, some malicious Roman rulers chose spectators to take their place, cutting out their tongues so they couldn't object. Sometimes those same rulers purposefully chose deformed or mentally ill citizens to be thrown to the beasts simply for entertainment and fun. It perhaps goes without saying that the gruesome sport of Vinash EO didn't have the regulations we see with modern-day sports, and it seems the players would have much rather gone out as a gladiator or even a bestiary than as a convict. Much of the knowledge we have about ancient Egypt was gleaned from their many hieroglyphics. We know how they buried their dead, how they built pyramids, and we know their methods of competition. Fisherman's Joust was a game crafted for the brave and was used to determine fishing territory. Teams gathered in boats, each player brandishing a long pole called a gaff with pointed ends that could either act as an oar or a weapon, depending on the competition. The beatings alone weren't violent and malicious. So often players walked or swam away with broken bones and bruised, bloody flesh. Swimming wasn't a common sport, so men often thrashed and flailed themselves as fast as they could out of the Nile River to shore. But sometimes bloody and wounded players were too enticing of a meal for the lurking hippos and crocodiles to resist. Over the centuries, the sport has spread from Egypt to many European countries, except in these modern-day fishermen's jousts, the stakes aren't nearly as high or as deadly. The oldest and deadliest sport known to the world, Allama, has been played in Mesoamerica for the last few thousand years, long before the first Olympics. Just as animated film The Road to El Dorado depicted, the game is played on a court with two high walls on each side, both walls containing a sideways ring. The object of the game is to keep the ball from touching the ground and to try to get it through the ring. But the film left out the brutal and savage nature of Allama. The game ball was made of solid rubber and could only be passed by the players jumping in the air and jutting out their hip at the 9-pound behemoth. There are even several accounts of players dying from internal bleeding from the ball slamming into their stomachs or sides. But Allama earned its notorious reputation for the aftermath of the game. The losing team was sacrificed. Oftentimes, the bones of those sacrificed were placed around the court as an offering to the gods and a reminder of the consequences of losing. After getting their hearts cut out, the losers' heads were removed and their skulls were used as the next ball. That's all for now. YouTube has been targeting videos just like this one and making it harder for me to create this content for you. To learn more and resist this change, see my Patreon at patreon.com/RobDyke, linked in the description below, and help keep creepy on YouTube. Again, visit patreon.com/RobDyke, linked below, to help fight this change. Thank you for listening. Now be sure to check out another one of my videos, and of course don't forget to subscribe to my channel because you won't want to miss what's next. And I'll see you next time.